How's it going, everyone? This is just a sound check. Let me know in the chat if you can hear me fine, and then we'll get started. Nice. Nice. Okay, welcome everybody to the stream. I know it's been a little while. We did our last one a little over a month ago. I've been working on some other content as well as some other things, so wasn't able to get one out in time. I'm also gearing up for what will be season 4 of Engineer Man live streams. It'll be something new. Each year we choose some kind of new format. For season 3, it was Q&A, and we started that I think in January, and it's gone all the way through the rest of the year. I expect we'll do probably 2 more streams this year, Q&A style, and then I'm going to come up with hopefully something different going into 2021, which will just bring you more cool content, so it'll be good. As far as this stream, as you know, we are talking about APIs and third-party integrations. I want to choose this stream because it's a topic that is so prominent out there in the world. Everything you do seems to integrate with everything else. And because of that, you're going to, of course, inevitably work with APIs. This is going to be true whether you're doing personal projects or if you're hired by a company to work on their product. At some point, you're going to do an integration, you're going to work with an API, and it's just very important that you kind of know what's going on with that. So that's why I picked this, and we'll jump into the questions. We had a total of, I think, 12 questions submitted. That's enough for pretty much the entire stream, but I want to take some questions from the chat as well. So if you want to ask me a question, the best way to do so is to put the letter Q colon, or question colon in front of your question and submit it into the chat. What that'll do is that will push it to a channel on Discord for me. That way I will see it. I'll try to also watch chat as well, but it's not guaranteed that I see it in chat. So best way to do it is to use that prefix, and that's how I'll get it. I have a couple channel announcements, and then it'll take me a couple minutes, and then we'll jump right into the stream main content. So our first announcement is around Emkc Contests. Probably a lot of you came from my Discord server. If you didn't, we have been carrying out weekly coding contests. We have a bunch of different languages you can use, and they are a code golf style, which means that you're looking to create the shortest solution and submit that to the contest. And you're able to do it in multiple languages if you want. Also, if you're not interested in doing it code golf style, you can simply use it as a weekly challenge to use. It's fresh. It's a fresh challenge every week, and we try to make it something that is original, or at a minimum, some reimagination of a contest that's already out there. That way, you're not just getting some contest that's been posted, 30 times on the internet. You're getting something new and cool to work out. I know a lot of people have had a lot of fun. It's growing in popularity. I think the last contest there was like 80 solutions submitted. So it's pretty cool. If you want to get involved in that, go to emkc.org/contests. And you don't even need to be on Discord if you don't want to, although it's better if you are, because people like to discuss, what's going on with the contest, and it really is a lot of fun. So definitely come check that out if you're interested. The second thing, and this is just for Discord folks on the Discord, is I've elevated the role of Discord hero up to what I'm now calling community hero. And as the Discord server has transitioned more from a place for my fans on YouTube, it's grown to a much broader community. The Discord server now is approaching 13,000 people, which is a lot, and a lot of people are finding it through channels other than YouTube. So we're transitioning to more of a community, and thus we're identifying people who are both knowledgeable and active to be community heroes. If you are interested in being one of those people, it's very easy to get involved. Just come to the server and be active. You'll be identified, and that'll be that. So a lot of good stuff's going on there if you want to check it out. Then the final announcement is I'm going to be trying out a new piece of content. I don't know if it's going to be called my thoughts or my perspectives, or my insights, something like that. Is I want to start putting out content that is timely and relevant. Right now, I just put out content that's relevant, which is to say that I'll put out something on JavaScript. But the thing about JavaScript is it's not new. JavaScript's been around for 2 decades. But what I want to do is put out content that is recent as well. So like if something major happens that's related to engineering or programming, I want to put out a short piece on that just to give my thoughts on it. And that's just because I get asked a lot, what do you think about this? Or what do you think about that? So I want to memorialize those in actual videos now. And I think that'll be good for things that are recent. This will not impact my core content. This is something that I'm going to do periodically as needed, when I feel like I should. But as far as my core content, streams and Sunday videos, that will not be impacted in the slightest. So this is not intended to replace that content. It's intended to complement it with something that's less on demonstration, but more on perspective. Hopefully, I feel like I have a lot of experience in a lot of spaces, and I think I can typically offer some new things to the conversation. So that's going to be the purpose of that content. And that's it. So I think it's time to jump into the main bulk of the content. So like I said, I'm going to be going through all the questions that were submitted to me ahead of time. And then I'll also take questions from the chat as I see them and as they're submitted to my Discord. And that'll be that. Let's see here. Let's get set up here. There we go. I probably did this ahead of time. Okay, so the first question I got was from Tomsy. Why is using a server such as Apache or Nginx as a reverse proxy the way to go when deploying live instead of exposing the API directly? So a lot of people, there's a couple reasons for this, and it's important to break down kind of what the API is. There's pure APIs, and those are just APIs that are exposed, that are just JSON in, JSON out. They don't serve static assets. They don't serve HTML. They don't do anything like that. They're just pure RESTful APIs, JSON in, JSON out. For those APIs, probably the best reason to put it behind Apache or Nginx using what's called reverse proxy is for SSL termination. That's one of the major things. If you don't do SSL termination, what you'd end up having to do is you'd have to terminate SSL at your application. So if you make a Python API, you'd have to have it listen on port 443, and you'd have to actually terminate SSL at that point. The other thing you'd have to do is you'd have to handle port 80 redirection to 443 within your application, and this could be problematic. So now if you terminate SSL at the web server level, then essentially what's happening is people make a request into Nginx, terminate SSL, and then from there, Nginx can route the request to wherever it needs to go. So if it's port 80, it can do the internal redirect on its own. If it's port 443, then it can proxy it through to your application that's running on the backend. Now, if you have web APIs, and when I say web APIs, I'm describing kind of a blend of APIs that are JSON in, JSON out, but also ones that return HTML. For that sort of thing, you can really benefit from caching with Nginx. The other thing you can benefit from is if you're serving assets, you can detect a specific route at the web server level that says, okay, I should probably serve everything at this route from, say, a folder. Now, what this allows you to do is have Nginx serve your assets as opposed to having like your Python or Node.js program serve your assets, because that's sort of just overkill. That's like breaking out the combine harvester to tidy up the flower pot. You might as well use the kind of lightest weight thing for the lightest weight operation. And then finally, and this is something people may or may not care about, is with a Linux, you need root permissions to bind to ports under 1024, or maybe it's 1024 and below, not 100% sure. But as you know, HTTP, HTTPS runs on ports 80 and 443. So the implication there is that if you are running your application directly without a reverse proxy, you will have to run your application as root. And that's because it's the only way to bind to port 80 and 443. And that may be problematic. By using a reverse proxy, you can run your app on like port 20,000. And then within Nginx, you can have it proxy through to port 20,000. And that's a good option for that. Check chat here. What do you think about Webassembly? So I think Webassembly is amazing, and I've actually put out a video kind of experimenting on Webassembly and how that works. You should definitely check it out. I think it's I think it's a very cool thing, but it's a very new thing. And obviously it's a lot more effort to make things in WebAssembly. So I question its adoption right now, but I think it's really cool and I hope it becomes big. So the second question was asked was, how does one go about securing, this question was asked by KevBot. How does one go about securing self-created APIs? There's plenty of options out there, Json Web Tokens, plus authentication middleware, using authorization scopes, etc. What are some of the best practices that you can think of? So I start by looking at what does this API do? And there's a couple different APIs. It's ones where you access your own data, and there's ones where you access data on behalf of a user. So like you wouldn't use, say, an API key or authorization scopes interchangeably. Authorization scopes is kind of something specific to Oauth 2, which we're actually going to talk about a little bit later. We'll talk about the specific Oauth 2 flow. That way you can understand that a little better. But if I'm making an API that's just for my, say I've made a business, maybe that business helps people make shopping carts, I don't know, or sell things online. And I'm making an API so that they can access, say, like their orders or their inventory programmatically. All I'm really going to do is I'm just going to make an API, and I'm going to make an API key, and I'm going to let them just plug that API key into their calls and be done with it. Now, if this is something you do, you should make this key revocable. This is one of the good best practice, because if their key somehow gets leaked or whatever, you're going to need to have a way for them to revoke that and regenerate it. Because if you didn't, then the person that has access to their API key now can just basically be them, pull data that doesn't belong to them, things like that. So you should make it revocable. This is where like Json Web Tokens comes in. Json Web Tokens is going to be a more secure version that has more of like disposable tokens. That way you don't have to have a single one, because under the first API model, you will just have a single key for everything. Well, you have one key per customer. So each customer will have one key. That key will never change unless they explicitly revoke it and regenerate it. Otherwise, it'll just stay exactly the way it is. Json Web Tokens gives you a little more security, allows you to dispose of them. Now, for APIs that deal with the user info, so think about like a good example is probably Emkc. So Emkc lets you log in with Discord, and in doing so, it has to do that through Oauth 2, and it has to do that because there's a couple steps involved. I must first get authorization from the user, and that's going to be the person logging into Emkc. I need to say, hey, I'm going to be accessing your data. Are you okay with that? And this is something that Discord provides. Discord makes sure that you know that I'm going to get your data, and they'll tell you exactly what that data is. And in that case, I can then, once I'm authorized to get that data, I can then make authenticated calls to a Discord API to get that data. And that's the only real way to do it, because otherwise you'd have to have one API key per user per company. And that wouldn't work. Like I wouldn't have an API key for every user in my database that accesses Discord, of course. That's not really how that works. So Auth 2 becomes the only way to do that. And again, if Auth 2 is confusing to you, there's a question that specifically asks how Auth 2 works, and I'll be covering that here in, I think, a few questions. Does any major projects got affected by the GitHub taking down YouTube-DL? So somebody actually asked about YouTube-DL, so I'll save it till I get to that. I have a couple thoughts on that. Joseph Doria asked, is an API basically a library that access someone else's services? So an API is the web service that lets you access a service, but as far as libraries go, there are libraries that exist which will use a service's APIs internally, but expose those functions in a way that's a little more common for the language you're using. So if you're using Node.js, it would just expose it as a JavaScript function like create user. But then when you call that internally, that library will call backend APIs. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's essentially what it is. The API is the thing that lets you access stuff. And I say stuff because the stuff could be anything. It could be your own data, it could be Bitcoin price, it could be anything at all. I've heard of JWT Oauth and a lot of authentication mess. Is there much overlap? It's always somebody trying to do it better and more securely and easier. You know, I tend to think that just flat API keys is the simplest, easiest way for everyone. And I say everyone because the more complicated the authentication scheme, the more complicated it is to both implement as the service who is allowing people to access data, as well as the folks who are actually going to do the implementation. So if you're the one building an integration against a service that's using, say, Json Web Tokens, then that's something that you will need to understand how to do. Whereas an API key, you know, that's the easiest way. You take the key, you plug it into the authorization header, and you are pretty much done. So it's all sort of a trade-off, and there for sure is overlap. You know, the thing they all do in common is they offer secure authentication with an API. This is the second question by KevBot. If you were to design a new API from scratch, what are some general tips you would provide to make the API as consistent as possible as it grows in scale and endpoints? Probably the most important piece of advice I can think of for this is going to be make a plan. For the most part, every time I see APIs that kind of fail or get messy or something like that, it's all because people just sort of built out their API kind of by the seat of their pants. And you still rocking 8 Mars? Yes, I am. You know, the APIs get built out in a really rough way. Nobody ever has a plan, and that's probably the biggest problem. So what you want to think about is when you're building an API from scratch, you want to first identify what's the different resources that are going to be in play for your API, because typical RESTful APIs, they deal in resources, either collections of resources or individual resources, and then they use specific HTTP verbs to take specific actions on those resources. So if you have an API that returns, say, you know, cat pictures, then you might have an endpoint called like /pictures, which will return all the pictures, you know, /picture/ID, which will return one picture, and then the verb like delete /picture/ID, which would delete one picture. So everything kind of deals in resources, and if you know those up front, it makes your API a lot easier to author. So you want to think about that ahead of time. This is now one note I put here is that's much easier when the product already exists. So you might get asked to build an API for something that doesn't actually exist yet, and that's of course going to be most problematic because that's going to be something that's subject to change. And if somebody changes kind of what the product does, then you're going to end up reforming what the data looks like, and thus you're going to end up reforming what the API looks like, and that's where you can get into trouble. But try to have a plan, try to think of things in resources. The other thing is try to think of like what should be its own resource and what should be a sub-resource. And I put a little example here. So if I had an API that was users could create an account and they could post images. The images could be of whatever. It's not important what the images are, but there's a couple ways that you could structure your RESTful API to represent this. You could do a users endpoint, and then you could do a users/ID/images endpoint, and this would get you all of the images for a given user ID. And this is called sub-resources. So this is a resource that's within another resource, and it's a good option for this sort of thing. But what you may want to do is you may want user images to be its own resource. So you got to kind of think about, you know, what it is you want to do, which is more appropriate, because this can get kind of messy, you know, because you can have sub-resources of sub-resources of resources, and you know that's obviously a little messier than just a single sub-resource. So you got to kind of look at it and say, well, what's best? And you know, there is no silver bullet. I can't sit here and say you should always choose this option, because you know there's no such thing as like the perfect way to do it. It's all based on what resources you're trying to serve, and how tightly they relate to another resource. But think about what you'd like to do there, and then just stick to it. The most important thing is consistency, really. And then finally, with the naming, be consistent with the naming. I have a personal preference when I name API endpoints, and I do so with hyphens if the words get too long. But there's no set format. If you would like to use underscores, or God forbid you want to use camel case, I guess you could do that. I don't recommend that. Or if you want to squash everything together, that's cool too. I think the most important thing is that you just do it consistently. Just pick one and stick with it. Don't have some endpoints that are underscores and some endpoints that are hyphens and some endpoints that are squashed together. Why not IMG? You could, sure. Yeah, it's again, if you want to name everything that says images IMG, just make sure you do IMG everywhere. That's the most important thing. But here again, like API URLs are supposed to map specifically to resources, and they're supposed to describe kind of what that resource is. So you want to name it in a very logical way if you can. And then finally, think about HTTP codes and decide up front which ones you're going to use. So I know a lot of people, they just want to use a couple, codes. Like it's either a 200 or a 404. And I don't think that's appropriate. I think you should use HTTP codes properly, because people that integrate with your API are going to expect that you're using them properly. But there are some times where it's not 100% clear like what you should use. So you can imagine that if you're requesting, say, all the books or all the images from something, what would happen if there's no images to return? Well, there's a couple possible HTTP codes that you could use. You could use 404, which says that the resource is simply not found. There's no books found. But that might not be appropriate. You might just return a 200 because an empty value is still a value, if that makes sense. So you have to think about what codes you're going to use and which ones make sense. 204 is no body returned. But that could also be a 404 because it's not found. So it's tough to say. Whatever you do decide, again, the overarching theme here is consistency. And that's the most important thing, is that you stay consistent, and that anytime you return an empty body, if you return it as a 200 and an empty array on one, then you should do that for everything. When you're going to start memberships, any plans on private streams? So there's no... I've had the option to enable YouTube memberships for quite some time, but I don't want to do that, because that's a slippery slope into commercialization of both my channel and my content, and I don't really like that. I'd rather just stick to the ads and the very rare and periodic sponsored video. Currently I've done 3 over the course of 183 pieces of content, so roughly once every 60 videos. So I'm trying to avoid that. I've had a bunch of people ask me how they can support me directly. There's currently no way. I just enjoy making the content. You don't have to give me anything for it. You can just enjoy the content, and that's that. You don't have to. It's all free. You don't have to pay me anything. It's no problem. Maybe in the future we'll do memberships. I don't know. I think if I did a membership, I would really like to make sure that I have something really great to give to those people, because if those people are going to give me their hard-earned money, then I want to make sure that I give them some good stuff in return. So I'll have to think on that a little bit more. Right now, there's no plans for memberships at the moment. But thank you for asking. I appreciate it. Okay, next question is, what do people mean when they talk about API wrappers? This was asked by George. So you could think of an API wrapper, and we actually kind of talked about it already through another question I got from chat. You can kind of think of an API wrapper as code written in another language that uses the API internally. So when you're using an API, you kind of have 2 options. You can use the API internally, which means crafting your own HTTP calls and sending them in, and then you get a response back. The other thing you can do is you can use a library that will implement the entire API in that library, And then you could just call functions within that library without having to use the API itself. And one of the most powerful things the API wrappers do probably is the ability to combine multiple calls. So like if you had an operation you'd have to do through an API, which would involve making, say, 3 calls in series. So maybe you're a customer with a CRM, customer whatever manager, the place where you can put in info for all your customers and this and that. And imagine if you need to put new customers in, you got to make a call. Excuse me. You have to make a call first to add the customer. And then once you have the customer, you have to make a call to add their info. And once you have their info, you got to make a call to add a note, for instance. That's 3 things. With an API wrapper, they might just expose you one single function that will just make all 3 of those calls in series completely transparent to you. And this is very powerful. Me personally, I try to use the wrapper if it's provided. It's not always, because sometimes the companies will provide official wrappers for their APIs, but other times it's up to the community. And this is particularly true if it's a less common language. So you're much more likely to find an API wrapper for something like Python and Node.js than you are for something like C or Haskell or something else. So you got to kind of look at what it is. Prodvision asks, hello, what's a third-party integration? So a third-party integration is really just any time you work with some other service that's out there on the internet and you use their service in some way programmatically, we would call that a third-party integration. So if, like, take FelixBot on Discord. If you do Felix GIF and you type something in, I've done a third-party integration against Giphy.com. And what that lets me do is pull GIFs from Giphy.com and serve them up. Take my money and feed Chase. I will buy $5 worth of dog treats and feed him promptly. I appreciate the 5, Calix, thank you. So, yeah, that's anytime you work with a third-party service, we call that a third-party integration. And that's true of anything. That's true of if you are a company integrating with some mail service to send email, or if you are pulling data from YouTube or whatever. It's all integration. If you are writing code to access that data, call that integration. Okay. And then, of course, API wrappers, the biggest thing it does is hide all the complexity. And a lot of times, that's what people really want. They don't want to, you want to get started fast. So a lot of people want to get going quick. Quickest way to get going is with an API wrapper. Otherwise, you got to learn the entire API. But there's also some downsides. It doesn't come without a downside. The downside of using an API wrapper is you are, 1, dependent on them to keep it updated according to the newest APIs. I've had issues before where I did a third-party integration using a provided API wrapper about 5 years ago against a payment gateway. And what happened is the payment gateway, they released a breaking change to that gateway. And the breaking change required everybody to change API calls they were making. The problem is the API wrapper that I was using went unmaintained. So I was kind of forced in this weird position to either write my own integration or find a different API wrapper and use that instead. So given that option, I was a little turned off by the fact that went unmaintained. So ultimately I decided to just write my own, and that was better for me, but here again, this is a payment gateway. I was using a language that was kind of new at the time, and the library just went unmaintained. This would likely not happen with something like, say, Twilio or Twitter. Their officially provided libraries will stay maintained and stable forever, but you got to be careful. Sometimes it's not better to use the pre-built stuff. Sometimes it's better to make it yourself. Ethan Edwards asked, is something like discord.py an API wrapper? Yes, absolutely. It's actually a wrapper for the Discord API. It's also a wrapper for the Discord gateway. And that's exactly what that is. You can, believe it or not, you can make bots without Discord.py at all. You would just have to write your own integration against the Discord gateway to listen for events, and then you'd have to make all the API calls yourself. But yes, you are exactly right. Discord.py is 100% for sure an API wrapper, and also much more. Do you know of any free cryptocurrency price, not Bitcoin API? It's free. I used to use Bittrex. I'm sure they still have a public API. If they don't, then I'm not really sure. I haven't done much in the way of cryptocurrency in a couple of years now, but I would check out Bittrex. Or maybe it's a BitTrex. I never actually knew. Okay, next question. What is an API? What is a Google API? I don't understand how you use it. Please explain. Thanks. Harry, smiley face. So an API is application programming interface, and then a Google API is just an API exposed to access some Google service. So when people talk about Google APIs, all they're referring to is some service out there on the internet that was made by Google that has an interface that you have to access it with, and that interface is the API. So take Google Drive API. So if somebody said, integrate with Google Drive API, the first you would do is you would create a cloud account with Google and then activate that API. And take special care to note whether or not it's a paid API. Some of Google's APIs require you to pay them money, others are free. You got to kind of look to make sure, don't get yourself into a situation where you're racking up an API bill, and you don't even realize it. But you would then create an API key, and then you can make calls into the endpoints that are part of that Google API, and all of them are documented. And this is true of Google and everywhere else. And you can see all the endpoints you can call into, and all the methods, and all the data they return, and all that good stuff. And you can integrate that way. It's pretty easy. Oh, this is a charity stream for feeding Chase. Well, then feed him some more. And thanks for all the help. You're welcome, Threshman. Thank you for that. Yeah, he's up to now 1/2 of one bag of nope. He's up to 4 pounds of food now. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. I will feed Chase with that money, no problem at all. Yeah, Google Drive Google Drive API with the nauseated face. So yeah, Google APIs are sometimes not the easiest to work with, but they're all the same though, which is to say there's a service and there's a programmatic way to access things in that service. So yeah, Harry, hopefully I helped you there, but it's really just reading the docs, getting an API key, making some test calls. Check chat here. An API can call, Yoast asks, an API can call other websites, and an API can call other websites and return with its own data. So when would it be called an API wrapper versus just an API? So an API is just an API. An API wrapper is a client library which works with an API. So like, all wrappers require APIs, but not all APIs require wrappers, for instance. Hopefully that clears that up. So it's like Google NPM Twitter client library, and you'll find that there's a client library for making authenticated calls into Twitter, but you'll never actually work with the Twitter API directly, and we would call that a wrapper. Okay, next question was asked by Terry. Can any language be used to contact third-party APIs? Yes, absolutely, 100% for sure. And that's because APIs are built in a generic way. Like APIs are not authored such that they only work for specific languages. They're authored such that you can access all pieces of their platform programmatically. So really all you need to do that is, I wrote API client, but that's supposed to be HTTP. All you really need to access an API is an HTTP client. You don't technically even need you don't technically even need a language at all. You could just use Insomnia and make calls into an API that way. So there's a lot of different options. Now, depending on the API and the language used, a wrapper might be published that makes things easy. And we won't go back into that again, but you know, you can always look for that if you, yeah, Chuck Norris API is a good laugh. Yeah. And that's actually a fun way to experiment. Is there's a lot of open APIs out there that do, you know, various things of varying degrees of usefulness. And you know, there's like dog pick generating APIs, you know, Chuck Norris API, there's a ton of different stuff, but it's a good way to experiment. You know, if you want to get your feet wet with some integrations, you know, go integrate with the Chuck Norris API. You know, if you have a Discord server, make your bot respond to /Chuck Norris quote and contact a Chuck Norris API and then post that to your server. There's a lot of fun things you can do that that will teach you how to make all this work. Ethan asks, what's a post, get, and rest? So post and get are HTTP methods, but there's also additional methods like delete, patch, options, put, trace, and I feel like and head. And all they're really for is determining the action that a resource should take. You know, so often get requests are used for retrieving data, post requests are using for creating data, put and patch is for updating data, and then deleting is for deleting data. So or specifically it's for working with resources in APIs. So, you know, oftentimes you might have 3 URLs that are exactly the same, but they differ only in their verb, which means they differ in their action. You know, so like the URL might be get/users/ID, and then you might have delete/users/ID, and then one would retrieve a user and one would delete a user, but the URL would be the same. And this is a way of not having to bake the action into the URL. Like you wouldn't do delete user in the URL, you would simply do user with the method of delete. TMSW, thank you very much. Oh, it's a sticker. Nice, that sticker, sweet. Keep it up. I will. I love doing these streams and putting content out for everybody, so thank you very much for that. I appreciate all the donations so far. And I've actually never seen you on a stream before. I usually remember people that come to my streams all the time. I recognize you. You know, I try to pay close attention, make it really personal. So I see a lot of new names, but also a lot of people that I see a lot, like Donovan and Thomas and several other people. But yeah, welcome to all the new people to the stream. Using the dad joke API, yep. Yeah, seriously, if you want to experiment with APIs, there's so many. And I think there's even like an API registry where people can register, you know, various APIs that do various things. Yes, you as well. And also Ugandan Knuckles, I've seen you before. Beast, I've seen you before. Tony, I think I've seen you before. Who else? Avi, for sure, I've seen you. You've been here all the time. You're also in my server, I know that. Javier, Nerd No One Likes, yep. You guys are all stream regulars, you're in my server. I know that because I pay attention to everything that's going on. Okay, the next thing is Oauth 2, and this is probably the most common question, so if this is going to be probably a big learning thing for people, because Oauth 2 is often very confusing, but I'm going to really simplify it for you, and it should make it pretty easy. Now, before we talk about how Oauth 2 works, we got to first just briefly talk about why you would even use Oauth. And remember, you're using Oauth because you're trying to access the data of somebody else. You know, remember, if you want to access your own data, you typically just get an API key and you're done. But if you want to access somebody else's data, you have to first get authorized to do so. So if you're writing an Oauth 2 integration against something like Twitter login or Google login, Facebook login, Discord login, or you want to get any data from any of those places, you have to start the Oauth 2 flow. And the first step to that is you have to send the person to the service you want to get authorized by. So if you have made an application and you want to do an Oauth 2 authentication against, say, I'll just say LinkedIn. So, but it's the same no matter what the service is. First thing you do is you send that person to a specifically crafted URL, and LinkedIn will provide this. you send them over to LinkedIn to get authorized. And what you're going to send with that message, and again, they'll tell you what this is. You're going to send the client ID, which will be related to the application that you have. That way, when the user gets there, they'll say like, you know, engineer man's application wants to access your account data. You know, the other thing you'd send is what you want to access. This is called an authorization scope. So you might access like the identity scope, which just gets basic info like username, you know, join date, whatever. And then sometimes there's the email scope. Sometimes there's scopes that are specific to the data you want to access. And this is a way of the people that are implementing OAuth 2 restrict you to what data you want to get. And for every scope that you request, it's going to tell the user that. It's going to say, hey, this particular service is requesting access to this particular data, and you should know that ahead of time. So don't click authorize if you don't want them to get that data. How fast can you solve a Rubik's Cube? I've done it in 42 seconds. That's my fastest. So now once the user authorizes you access to the API, authorizes you access to their data, what it's going to do is it's going to return the user back to a callback URL. And this is something that you pre-program up front. You say, okay, when the person authorizes, send them back to this URL. And the one thing that's going to get sent back from LinkedIn to that URL is going to be what's called an access code. And that access code is going to be a temporary code that basically says, hey, the user authenticated with our site. They've signed off on your ability to get their data. Here's an access code that you can use to accomplish that. Now, once you have an access code, you make another call to LinkedIn to exchange that access code for an access token. And it's that access token that you actually use in the API to make authenticated calls. So you exchange your access code for an access token, and then you plug that access token as the authorization header, authorization bearer, and the access token, and then you make a call to an API to get that user's data. And because that access token was generated from an access code, which was authorized by the user, then you'll be allowed to get that user's data. Now, you may also get a refresh token. This will let you basically refresh that authentication. But for the most part, the token you get is temporary and will expire. You know, if you need prolonged access, you use the refresh token or you make them authorize again. And that's really it. So to recap, they go to the service, they authorize it, they come back to your app with an access code. You then exchange the access code for an access token. You get the access token back. You then use the access token to make authenticated calls to an API. That's it. And if you want to see an example of an Auth 2 flow taking place, you can find it in the Emkc source code. It's very brief. I think I do the entire Auth 2 flow in like 50 lines of code manually. I'm not using any wrapper or anything like that. I'm doing it all myself because it's not that hard. So if you want to see how that works, just have a look at Emkc. In the Auth controller, you can find the Oauth 2 flow there. And that's an Oauth 2 flow that integrates against Discord. But they're all basically the same with slight modifications. Easy peasy. Building API from scratch, Node.js or Python, busy learning JS but prefer Python. Either one, doesn't matter. They're both fine. I mean, you know, a lot of these, like what should I build stuff in, all comes down to preference. You know, like I've been working with Node.js pretty much since it started. So I prefer that, but Python's fine too. AJ Kumar, keep up the great work. Thank you for the 2. I appreciate that. And welcome to the stream. I don't recognize your name. So hopefully this was your first one and not your last. And thanks again. I appreciate it. Okay, next question is from, I can never pronounce this name, Joao, maybe? How do you keep API keys a secret in single-page applications where requests to an endpoint, e.g. Open Weather Map, are made from a client? So this is a little, it's kind of misleading. You know, people think, oh, this is a secret, you know, but it's kind of out there in the open. And sometimes this is true, sometimes it's not. So the short answer is you can't protect it. If that secret is required to access specific data, then that's that. It's got to be in the application. But in the case of Open Weather Map, and also other like JavaScript delivered things that are in the browser, like Google Maps or various other things, typically what you could do is you can say, do not allow access to this API or this map or anything unless it's on a known domain. So if your domain is, weathermaps.com and you're using Open Weather Map, you should be able to configure, and I know you can in Google Maps, you should be able to configure in there to say, do not allow this API key to be used unless you're on the domain weathermaps.com. So if you do that, you effectively null and void any malicious use of that key. Now, if it's not related to like a maps thing, or if it's an API key that's related to just access to an API on behalf of the user, then you don't really have to worry about protecting it, because if the user were to take that API key, they would really be stealing something that they already have. There's no point for them to steal their own API key. That's not useful. It's only useful if they can steal an API key that lets them do other things. So I think you gotta just look at what is it that API key is even accessing, and do you even have to be concerned that it's sort of out there in the open? And in the case of Open Weather Map and Google Maps and OpenStreetMap and all these other places, you just say operate only on this domain, and then it's not really an issue. It's no problem. So hopefully that answered your question there. Is it a good idea to get API token using the API? So an API token could just be thought of as a thing that lets you access data through an API. It's not necessarily specific to any particular thing. Like an API token is a very generic term. I'm not sure I 100% understand the question, but yeah, you can get API tokens from APIs for sure. How about a limited edition Halloween EM sticker? When I put out my first sticker, I sold a ton of them, and the stickers were donated by a friend named Emmett from my server, and so he donated some sticker mule credit to produce about, I think, 350 stickers, and I think I sold I sold them at cost. I sold all the stickers just at cost. I didn't make any money on them. I wasn't trying to make money. I just wanted people to have stickers, and I think I sold like 150 of them within the first probably week, and it sort of panned off from there. But nobody's bought any for months now. So limited edition Halloween EM sticker, maybe we'll see. I do want to put out something else like that. I think it'll be neat, but yeah. Oh, thanks again for the second. I don't know if that's a duplicate or if you sent me two again. Thank you for that if you did. Oh, for the scammer bots video, yeah. A lot of people actually made it to Discord and to actually mostly to Discord and subscribed to the channel specifically from that video. That was sort of that's responsible for a good bit of the growth that the channel has seen. So I'm glad people really enjoyed that. I think that video has like 5 million likes now. I'm sorry, not likes, views, like 5 million views. No, you can't buy stickers anymore. I've since taken it down, but when it was up, nobody was buying them. I think I just exhausted, everybody that wanted stickers. So not a big deal. No big deal at all. Okay, so we're at the YouTube DL thing here. What are your thoughts on the recent takedown of YouTube DL, and what lessons can we learn from this as developers? This was asked by Joao. I didn't read over this in any crazy depth. I read over it just because I wanted to be aware of what was going on. And from what I've read, I think the major Hanjiman, hello, Shyam Sundar, how are you? So I think the major takeaway here is that if you're going to author tools that have both legal and illegal purposes, you must design them, document them, and market them in a way where it's made to be for the legal purpose only. And I think if you do that, then you're fine. So from what I've read with YouTube DL is they had like test code in there, and they had things that indicate that they were making a tool specifically to violate copyright. And I think that was probably an error they made. They probably shouldn't have done that, from what I can tell. But really, how is YouTube DL any different than a tool like Metasploit, on Kali Linux? That tool has both legal and illegal purposes, but nobody's trying to take it down for being a malicious tool. And I think the same is true here. I read about all the valid reasons to use YouTube DL. Like if I wanted to back up my own content and perhaps I've lost access to my account or something like that, then YouTube DL would be a perfect tool to pull all that data down for me. And now I can't do that because they've deleted it. And that would be a perfectly valid legal use of that tool. So yeah, I think mistakes were made there. It's, the third thing is it's a little chilling, to see them come down super hard, with a DMCA complaint on YouTube DL. That's a totally separate topic. There's probably a bit of politics in there too. I don't necessarily want to go into that, but it's not great when that kind of stuff happens, because it shows the power that these people have, and I don't know, it's a little concerning. So that's kind of my thoughts on that. Hopefully that was a good perspective. GitHub CEO is working to bring it back. Good. I hope so. I mean, it flies right in the face of open source tools at large, and you don't hear a whole lot about people doing take. In fact, I don't think I've ever heard one. I don't think I've ever heard of a DMCA takedown occurring on GitHub. I don't think I've ever heard that before. So that's kind of a new thing for me. So hopefully it comes back, or hopefully somebody just makes something new called DL-YouTube or something, but they market it such that it's for legal purposes only. And then they have no ground in doing so. You can't get rid of something just because it might be used for an illegal purpose. By that logic, you couldn't sell anything. You couldn't sell hammers because somebody might take a hammer and go hit somebody with it. But I don't know. Okay, ALX asked, I work in analytics and my company asked me to use a third-party service to pull data from, and they have a JSON API. I'm a little nervous because I've never done anything like this. Any tips? Yes, I have some tips. So the first tip is don't panic. It's actually a lot easier than you think, so it's not going to be too bad. So just take a second, cool off, and you'll be fine. So as far as third-party APIs that you're going to interact with, they're going to be documented really well. And they're going to be documented really well because the service, they want you to use it. It's often a feature more than it is like a thing. So they want you to use that API, so they're going to document it really well. The first steps towards making integration against this third-party service, and of course I don't know which, it wasn't supplied in the question as to which, but start by making an account and getting an API key. And then get yourself an HTTP client like Insomnia or Postman, and then you're going to want to experiment with that API, see what it can do. So, try to make a really basic call that just pulls some basic data, and then from there you can kind of expand out and make it do other things. And then once you're comfortable with how that API works in an HTTP client like Postman or Insomnia, then you can actually implement the code piece and make your application pull data directly through the code. But remember, you don't have to experiment using Python or Node.js. I know when I do integrations against APIs, I almost always work with it through Insomnia first, just to make sure I understand what it's doing, because it's just, for me at least, it's a lot easier to do it that way. So that would be my advice, but definitely don't panic. It's not a big deal. You'll be fine. Okay, we're down to 2 questions, which should work perfectly well. We got about 5 minutes left. I think it's going to be perfect timing. checking the question board as well here. Good question by Donovan. So difference or deciding what you pass to the API via the query string and what you should pass as header info. Main use of passing info via header. So it's not super common to pass like things you want to query through the header. Usually you would pass it either as a query string parameter, or you're going to pass it as part of the URL. So, and I'm assuming, I'm just going to make a little note down here. So there's a couple ways to do it. You could do like users/id like 1, or you could do users ID equals 1. And I'm going to assume that this is what the question means. And generally what I do is I try not to use query string parameters for addressing resources. So like if I know I want to access a specific user, I'm not going to do ID equals 1. I'm going to do it this way. But then if I want to do like filtering or something like that, that's really where query string parameters is very useful. So like, say you wanted to get, say you had an endpoint that gave you, all users of a company. You might do, what would you do? You do like companies, and then the ID of the company, and then you might do users, which would get you all the users for company ID 1, but then maybe you only want the active users. So you do like active equals 1, or something like that. So you wouldn't put like the active, you wouldn't put like 1 in there anywhere, because you're filtering on a resource, and that's going to be the users of a company, as an example. So yeah, I would think of it as, is what you want in the query string, is it an actual private key? Not private key, I'm sorry, primary key, or is it some sort of filter? If it's a filter, I would say use a query string. If it's not, I would say put it in the URL. And of course, you can only put one thing in the URL, really. You wouldn't want to put like 3 numbers in a row. That would just be confusing. What screen am I streaming off of? I am streaming on the second monitor on the bottom row, which is, I'm looking straight at it right here. Okay, second to last question. Why do some APIs use JSON, but some APIs use XML? So that's by unknown. So what you gotta know about this is that JSON is new. Relative to XML, it's new. And then XML is very old. XML was out before JSON. And XML is still very common in legacy systems. You got to keep in mind that if a system was authored, say 15 years ago, think like bank systems or whatever, they used XML because that's all there was. And they're not about to change now, because it's a lot of work, it's costly. So it's easier to just make people use XML than it is to say move to JSON. In an ideal world, no newly authored APIs would be using XML. Unfortunately, that's not the case. I still come across XML APIs, and it makes me furious because JSON is a much better option now. The only benefit to XML used to be schemas, which was essentially you would have the XML request, but you'd also have a schema which would describe like what that XML document should look like. And what that would allow you to do is validate that incoming XML was valid. You just apply the schema to it, and if it came back fine, then it was great, and that was that. But if you really need schemas in 2020, there's something called JSON with schemas, which gives you that exact functionality but with JSON, and it makes it a lot easier. So the reason is simply, how old is the code, and who's in charge at the company making these things. Like a hip startup in Silicon Valley is much more likely to use JSON than a company that's entrenched in really old ways of doing things, where the average, no offense to older people, but the average age of their developer crew is 50 or more. It's those folks, unfortunately, that are more likely to be stuck in the XML way or something like that. So yeah, it's all it's all just depending on which company you're working with, depends on what it is. But The real issue with XML, I think, is that there's no difference between an object with a single property and an array with a single element. And that's very unfortunate because it means that your XML can be absorbed in two different ways. And the only way you really know is by looking at the schema. If the schema says that this should be an array of numbers, then at least then you know it's an array. But sometimes they don't provide a schema at all because schemas are optional. Schemas are not required for the API to function. Schemas are something that the people authoring the API typically provides as an additional thing. Yeah, size JSON is less than size XML. That's 100% for sure. I would say on an order of probably half. I'd say it's about half the size at least. So I guess the takeaway here is if you're authoring new APIs, you should use JSON. But if you're integrating with third-party APIs, be expected to come across a blend of both, depending on how recent the code is and what type of market it is. And then the final question, and I know we're 1 minute over, we'll get through this real quick, and I think we've done all the questions here. So I think we've covered everybody's question that was relevant to the stream so far. So if you have any last minute questions, now is the time to ask it. The final question is, do APIs cost money? And the answer is, it's very rare for an API, like the data you get from an API may cost money, but it's pretty rare for people to charge for the API itself. You're usually paying for the thing that you get from the API. So like, if I have a business that's in, say, retail, and I want to offer you an API to access your data, I'm not going to be charging you to access that API. I'm going to be charging you to access the product at large. And oftentimes APIs can be thought of as like a selling feature. Like I would tell you, you should use my product because I have an API. Because maybe my competition doesn't have an API. Maybe they require you do everything through some control panel. So you can think of APIs as less about convenience and more about flexibility and some sort of marketing. To say that, okay, you can pay for my product, but if you also want API access, I'm gonna charge you for that too. That's pretty rare. That doesn't occur that often. The only time I've ever came across that, and I don't mind mentioning the company, is Bill.com. They actually charge to use an API, when in reality they should just offer it as a means to get involved in their product. I hope they change that, but so far they haven't. All right, let me check any remaining questions here. Let me check chat. Yeah, schemas were rare. Yes, schemas really are rare. You are not guaranteed to get a schema, but if you do, at least you then know kind of what the structure of the document is supposed to look like. Okay, I guess that's it. So we'll just wrap this up. So obviously, thanks everybody for coming out to the stream. I really appreciate it. Again, I see a lot of people. They come back time after time. Some people I've seen in what feels like every stream I've ever done. So that's really cool. The last thing I'll mention is that if you are not on my Discord server, you should go there. There's tons of stuff going on. Everything from contests. Oh, thanks for another awesome stream. In the watch later list when I get to my API project. Great, thank you very much for that. The 200 South African. I appreciate that, and you're a longtime supporter, of course. You've been around all my streams and my server for so long, so thank you so much for the consistent support. I really appreciate it. So yeah, if you want to go further, Discord is the best place to do that. We have coding challenges, we have coding contests, we have all kinds of different things there that you can do on Emkc, which is Engineer Man Knowledge Center. And you can also compete against other people at the contests are a competition. You can also earn badges and points and different roles in the server and all kinds of stuff, test your knowledge. And then anybody that takes part in one of the first 10 contests, which will be just the next 2, will get a special exclusive early contest participant badge, which you'll never be able to get again after that. So if you want to get involved in one of those, go there and look at the Emkc channel for announcements on that. And we do contests every Sunday. They start at noontime Central, which I think after daylight is going to be 6 p.m. GMT. I think. I'll have to clarify that. I'm not 100% sure. So, yeah, great stream, man. Loved it. Great. Thank you, Harley. I appreciate that. Ricardo, thank you. Thank you for showing up. I appreciate that. So, yeah, also, I'm always in the server. I'm actually the most active person in my own server. So it's not like I'm never there. I'm one of the few probably people on YouTube who actually get involved in their community and enjoy being there daily. So you'll find me there. It's not hard at all. So if you want to ask me a question or come say hi, feel free to come and do that. As far as the next stream, we'll try to do one about 1 month from now. So the estimated next stream is probably going to be roughly November 5th. I would say November 5th is probably going to be the next stream. It might get extended to the 12th. It'll be either the 5th or the 12th, and I'll come up with some topic that we'll do it on, and that'll be the second to last stream of the year, in which we'll roll into the new year with hopefully some new content and stuff going on. So, other than that, I hope to see you on future videos, future streams, or the Discord server, and until then, I hope everyone has a fantastic rest of their weekend, and I will see you around. Take care.